The old manuscript smelled of dust and candle smoke. Pages yellowed with time carried words that once guided lives, laws, and punishments. In the quiet of the palace library, Prince Edward often sat before them, his eyes lingering on the strange and troubling customs of the past. It was winter, and snow tapped softly against the tall windows. The fire beside him burned low, casting a gentle warmth that mixed with the faint scent of ink. Edward traced the faded letters with his hand, almost as though touching the words would help him understand. He had grown up surrounded by tradition, weighed down by the heavy silence of his family's history. Now, with his tutor Harris at his side, Edward found himself staring not at the glory of medieval kings, but at their cruelties, customs so bizarre, so twisted, that to repeat them today would be unthinkable. Edward read aloud from the page, his voice quiet. They would heat an iron until it glowed red. The accused would carry it across the church floor. If burns healed clean, they were innocent. If not, they were guilty. His hand trembled slightly as he closed the book. How could pain be proof of truth? Harris leaned back in his chair. It was fear disguised as faith. They believed God would protect the innocent. But in truth, many lives ended in agony. Edward shivered. He thought of his own aches, his fragile bones, the small wounds that never healed quickly. In such a world, he would have been condemned without question. Another book spoke of crowds gathering in town squares. Children sat on shoulders, vendors sold food, and families cheered as a condemned man was hanged or burned. Edward closed his eyes. To turn death into spectacle, it feels monstrous. Harris nodded. It was not justice they sought, but distraction. Their lives were hard, and suffering became a kind of theater. For a long time, Edward said nothing. The idea of laughter mixing with screams made his stomach twist. On another page, an illustration showed a pig dressed in chains, standing before a judge. The text explained how animals could be tried for crimes, even sentenced to death. Edward laughed softly, though it was not with joy. They blamed creatures who could not defend themselves. Yes, Harris said. It gave them someone to punish, even when sense was lost. Edward thought of the hounds in the royal kennels, their loyal eyes and wagging tails. He imagined them dragged into a court, accused of crimes they could not understand. The thought broke his heart. The manuscripts described leeches, knives, and bowls of blood. Illness, they believed, was caused by too much fluid in the body. The cure was to drain it. Edward touched his own thin wrists, veins faint beneath the skin. They thought weakening the sick would make them well. Harris sighed. They trusted tradition more than truth. Many died not from disease, but from the cure itself. Edward nodded slowly. He knew something of weakness, of treatments that brought no relief. In this, the past felt too close. Edward turned a page and found drawings of women bound to stakes, fire curling around them. The text told of whispers, accusations, and fear spreading like wildfire. They burned them alive, Edward whispered, for being different, for being feared. Yes, Harris said quietly, and often it was the powerless who suffered. Women, the poor, the unwanted. The prince stared into the fire beside him, his face pale. The silence of his own palace seemed heavier, filled with shadows of all the voices once silenced in flames. Wooden frames stood in the town squares. Those accused of theft or gossip had their heads and hands locked inside, left for the public to mock, spit on, or strike. Edward frowned. Shame as punishment. Harris nodded. Humiliation instead of help. It left scars that lasted long after the wood was gone. The young prince imagined himself trapped, hands bound, the crowd laughing. His chest tightened. He knew too well what it was to feel small under the weight of others' eyes. A strange custom appeared in another chapter. In times of plague, some towns hired musicians and forced the sick to dance until their bodies gave out. They believed it drove out illness. Edward's brow furrowed. To make the dying dance, it feels crueler than silence. Harris agreed. It was fear turned into madness. They could not fight death, so they mocked it. The image lingered in Edward's mind. Thin bodies swaying in fever, music rising as life fell. It was a cruelty, hidden beneath the sound of fiddles and drums. Edward's hand froze on the page that told of noble children wed at 7 or 8, sometimes younger, their futures decided before they understood the meaning of love. He whispered, "They never had a chance to choose." Harris's face grew solemn. In the name of alliance and power, innocence was taken. Childhood was traded for politics. Edward thought of himself at 7, fragile and unsure, clinging to his mother's hand. The idea of being bound in marriage then filled him with quiet sorrow. Another manuscript listed tools: racks to stretch limbs, thumb screws to crush bone, iron masks heated until they burned the skin. Edward shut the book quickly, his breath unsteady. They believed truth could be forced. "Yes," Harris said, "but pain only brings silence or lies." For a while they both sat quietly, the fire crackling. Edward rubbed his wrists as though feeling the shadows of chains. The final custom was not written in laws, but in lives. In the medieval world, those who suffered rarely spoke for fear, for shame, for the weight of power. Edward felt the words cut close, his own family's silence about their burdens, their weaknesses, their secrets. It was not so different. He closed the manuscript slowly. The cruelty was not only in the acts themselves, but in the silence that allowed them. Harris looked at him with steady eyes. "And it is silence that we must break." For days afterward, Edward carried the weight of those 10 customs in his heart. They were not just tales of the past. They were warnings. Warnings of what happened when fear became law, when tradition blinded truth, when voices were silenced. And in that weight, he felt something new, a responsibility. If silence had preserved cruelty, then perhaps speech could preserve compassion. One night, as the snow thickened outside and the lamps flickered low, Edward spoke to his tutor in the library. "I want to tell these stories," he said. "Not to frighten, but to remind. If we forget how strange and cruel we once were, we may become so again." Harris smiled softly. "Then let us tell them, in words, in lessons, in truth." Edward looked at the shelves of old books, their pages filled with shadows, and for the first time he saw them not as chains, but as lanterns, guiding light for those willing to look closely. Years later, when Edward himself became a father, he sat once more by the fire with his young son. Snow still tapped the windows, and the fire still cracked softly. On his knee rested a small book, not the cruel laws of the past, but his own writing, a collection of stories. In gentle words, he explained how once people had made mistakes, terrible mistakes, believing them to be right. The boy listened wide-eyed, his small hand holding his father's sleeve. When the story ended, Edward whispered, "We are not bound to repeat the past. We learn from it, and we choose differently. That is how hope grows." The boy nodded slowly, and Edward felt warmth rise in his chest. The echoes of cruelty had not vanished, but in his son's eyes he saw the fragile bloom of something stronger: compassion. And in that quiet moment, Edward knew the past had not been read in vain. It had been faced, remembered, and turned into a seed for a gentler tomorrow.